Welcome back to the program. We are here with Stanislav Krapivnik, a former U.S. Army officer and political analyst, to discuss what is happening in the conflict between NATO and Russia in Ukraine. So thank you very much for coming back on.
Thank you.
So one would think over the past, 4 years, or you can go back to 2021, there's been a search for what a possible peace agreement would look like. So again, from the Ukrainian side, they would like some deterrence from Russia, which is understandable. Russia wants to ensure that Ukraine is not used by NATO as a proxy against it, which is also understandable. And this is also why it's very difficult in the security competition to find an agreement. Now, if we would have reached an agreement in 2021, it seemed that Russia was the balance was different then, because the guns hadn't gone off yet. That is, Russia was willing to then essentially allow all of Donbass to reintegrate to Ukraine in return for neutrality. But of course, we forward to 2025, the world looks very different now, and a political settlement to end the war and establish a status quo is still very, very important to stabilize the front between NATO and Russia. But it seems as if the more the war goes on, the further away we get, though, because now the 28-point plan, which you have, yes, obviously read, is now a 19-point plan. So essentially making more concessions towards Ukraine to bring Zelensky closer. It's how do you make sense of this? Well, let's start with the 28-point plan, or we don't know that much yet about the 19, but I'm assuming it will be to win over the Europeans and Zelensky.
Well, first of all, in my opinion anyways, this so-called fight between Trump and the Europeans and Zelensky is kabuki theater, and nothing more. This is shadow puppets. There's one plan, whether or not they put out 28 points, 58 points, whatever, how many points. If you actually look through it and you think just a little past what's written on there, it's 27 out of 28 points of surrender for Russia. There's nothing that's really guaranteed. The only point that's worth anything, and it shouldn't even be part of this document, is nuclear proliferation control, which the U.S. states as START 1 and other agreements, but there are no other agreements. The U.S. just backed out of every single one of them. This is the last one. And the U.S. is losing pathetically on all fronts on nuclear weapons as well. Which they left it because arrogantly we're gonna dominate Russia and China and everybody else, because we're the super duper power country with the super duper rockets. I think that's how Trump put them. The super duper rockets that could go anywhere and do anything, and they got the biggest boom, or using Trump speak. But the reality is the U.S. Nuclear force is in extreme decline. And there's not much the U.S. can do, because it's all these programs, including the weapons programs, the modern weapons programs for conventional warfare, first and foremost are forms of earning of corruption for the politicians, not about defense of the nation, and they haven't been in many decades. But this plan, if you look at it, it's 27 points of Russian capitulation, to include having Russia change its constitutional order, to change the constitution itself, to change the education system. Just look through this. It entitles basically Russia destroying itself, ripping out of bricks, and waiting to be attacked. The first points, the first and last points are the best ones. Because, by the way, the last point reads, and I'll just read it verbatim. 1 second.
Last point, ceasefire.
Yeah, once all parties agreed to this memorandum, the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both sides reach to agreed upon points to begin implementation of the agreement. First of all, a memorandum it's a letter of intent. It's a non-binding non-agreement. It's not an agreement. I mean, I'm as director of supply chain, I sign contracts up to 150, $180 million contracts. I signed letters of memorandum constantly. They don't mean anything. They're not a legally binding document. They just mean, hey, yeah, we've kind of thought about this and we're going to move toward this and maybe eventually come up with a contract and a deal. That's all they are. But the point is, though, it's back to ceasefire, which Moscow said, no way in hell are we going to ceasefire. There's not going to be a ceasefire. There'll be an agreed upon that the end of hostilities will be when the peace accords are signed, whatever those may be in whatever form. So right off the bat, the 28th point just nullifies the other 27 points because this just shows you that it's irrelevant. But the first point is, you start off right off the bat understanding what kind of agreement this is. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. By whom? Russia? Russia isn't the master of Ukraine. The U.S. has flat out, in the face of Rubio, come out and said, we're fighting a proxy war. So who's the proxy? Ukraine. A proxy, by its very nature, cannot be a sovereign state. It is a controlled state and a controlled force used by another power or group of powers to do their bidding. So Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. By whom again? By Ukraine? By Russia? Let's confirm and actually create a sovereign Ukraine by the West, which will never happen. It's the proxy. It's a puppet. And only get worse from there.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's an interesting point, though, because the whole idea of restoring Ukraine's sovereignty, this is it's a reasonable argument to make if we want Ukraine to be a buffer between NATO and Russia. But as you do point out, there's a heavy evidence, though, that its sovereignty was stripped of it after 2014. That is by the main media in the United States also recognized that the U.S. began to, in the words of New York Times and Washington Post, rebuild Ukraine's intelligence agencies from scratch to have it as a partner against Russia. We have the general prosecutor of Ukraine, who a former after Biden fired him, which is also a question about sovereignty. He later on went out and said that all new government officials had to be approved by Washington. And even the Americans put in their own people into key positions, like the finance minister, American citizen, worked for the U.S. State Department, and then taking over the post in 2014 as finance minister. So the intelligence agencies will know the influence of the army, that the military planning comes from American generals in Germany. The civil society, we also learned, though, with the NGOs and the USAID financing all of the, I think it was 90% of Ukrainian media is now paid under the pay of America. So the whole idea that it is that sovereignty means to be under the thumb of Washington, this is kind of flawed. Indeed, from my perspective, I always point to 2019, because this is when Ukrainians were allowed to vote, and they voted 73% for this peace platform. And you had the US-trained far-right militants who threatened Zelensky, and you had Western-financed NGOs also drawing red lines that you can't implement what the Ukrainians voted for. So at some point, you do have to ask, though, what does sovereignty mean? And it would be nice for Ukraine to have some sovereignty, but then you would have to recognize that that's a give and take. You can't just put it under American administration. However, how do you make sense of the European opposition here, though? Because the Europeans put together their own peace proposal, and if you go into reading any newspapers now, they can inform you that Western newspapers, that is, they can inform you that Europe has put forward a peace plan and Russia rejected it. It chooses war. But if you go through the European peace plan, it looks very different. I mean, from this perspective, the 28-point peace plan is, it's a pro-Russian peace plan. But how do you make sense of the European contribution to the peace here?
Well, by the way, the Minister Здравоохранения, Public Health, was also an American, and her job was to deconstruct the public health, which she did very well. She destroyed all the paid-for services. I mean, by government paid-for services, made it all private, made it extremely expensive, and that gets rid of your retirement class because they just die off. They can't afford medical services anymore, and that kind of saves money for Ukraine. Now they're looking at mobilizing them, so get them to die off even faster. Because Zelensky did sign a decree allowing 60-plus-year-olds to be invited to the front lines. Here's your walker, Mr. 80-year-old. Stand there and take one round for the country. Better than paying for your medication. That's the level. I mean, I'm saying it with a bit of a dark humor in it, but I mean, this is actual just genocide of age groups and classes that are going on by the West, directly by the West and their puppets. We're a broke country. We're going to save money by killing off the elderly. They're useless eaters. That's basically what we've seen and we've heard since about 2015, 2016. It hasn't gotten any better. As far as this peace plan and counter peace plan, this is the good cop, bad cop, because I think the actual biggest bone of contention between the EU and US is who gets to steal the Russian frozen funds and spend them. Because the US wants to steal them all and make all the money off of it, or at least 50% of the profit. Like, you got to figure out those 200 billion, at least a third of that's going to go by to everybody's pockets automatically, especially the US side. And then US companies will get hired to, quote, rebuild Ukraine. And then the profits, or whatever profits after those US companies take their profits, whatever profits above all that is left over, that mostly go to America. So yeah, the Europeans want to be, the Europeans in their minds have, I think, spent those 200 something billion dollar or euros worth of Russian assets about 5-10 times over. They need about $1 trillion or $2 to cover all the promises they've already made. But at least 200 billion is still 200 billion. They really, really want it. It's like an alcoholic. There are a bunch of alcoholics, and the only bottle of vodka or anything left is this golden bottle that's locked up they really can't have, but they really, really want it. And their hands keep stretching for it because that's the only bottle left to drink from. The but it's the fight is, it's a good cop, bad cop. See how bad the Europeans are. Our plan is a good plan for you. You just have to give up sovereignty. You have to change your education system. You have to change your constitution that you can't fight a foreign war anywhere. Just have to wait till we exterminate or build up enough force to exterminate you. See, Ukraine's going to half its military to 2.5 times larger than it was in 2022 to 600,000. The reason Ukraine has a military of 1.2 million, it doesn't. What it does do is it counts police, press, gangs, emergency services, anybody in any kind of uniform as part of the military. And then the actual fighting military, those capable of fighting, is much, much smaller. But we'll half that number. And see, we got 600,000. See, we went to half, which again is 2.5 times, almost 2.5 times larger than what they had in 22. And yeah, Ukraine can't join NATO. NATO can't expect. Of course, this is on paper. We've heard this before. Even we've heard it verbally. We've seen it on paper. Today it's on paper. Tomorrow it's no longer on that paper. It's on a new piece of paper that now they can. That's not binding. I mean, constitutions change, documents change. But they get to join the EU ASAP, which is a double-edged sword in this case. But all for Brussels. They get to join the EU. The EU wants to create an EU army. Okay, so today's NATO unit, battalion, German battalion for NATO, gets rebranded EU, and now it can go deploy in Ukraine because there's nothing blocking that. The other edge of that sword is the Austro-Hungarian, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, plus Poland, the Visegrad group, basically. That have been blocking, for good reason, blocking Ukrainian imports of grain, of other foodstuffs, because it'll destroy their own economies, and it's not regulated. So whatever GMO crops they're pushing in, whatever chemicals they're using, especially nowadays, considering how contaminated many areas are, there's not going to be any kind of guards against that. I mean, realistically. So they'll be able to just flood in Poland and Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, Czech, and destroy their agro economies, totally destroy them, which would actually probably be used by Brussels to try to remove the governments that are in power and bring in pro-Brussels governments. So again, it's a double-edged sword, but it's all good for the West, the bankers that are the international finance that's actually standing behind these politicians. So everything that you go through, there's nothing pro-Russian in this, but they're trying to sell it as, see, we're the good guys. Those are the bad guys. They really are. They don't want to talk to you. They really want war, but we want peace for you. Just rewrite your constitution that you can't fight a war, foreign war, where we build up in your borders. Just rewrite your constitution that you have to move new values, teach new values to your kids in schools. Tolerance, which is that code word for we're going to destroy your culture from the inside. We're going to pull you in the G8, which why would Russia need the G8? It actually should be that the G7 should be relabeled the D7, the debtor 7, not the not the government 7, because their economies are well, we know they're crap. They're all collapsed. They're all in massive debt. But this is an attempt to we're going to bring Russia back into the economic community. Well, actually, Russia is part of the economic community, just not part of the America plus vassals community, which is all died. But we have to break bricks, so we're going to try to break bricks this way. While we're investing in certain projects for the next 2 to 5 years before the next round of the big war starts, so we can secure certain elements for the U.S., which the U.S. still can't process rare earths, no matter how much it stockpiles. It has to actually build processing facilities. You can't throw a piece of rock into a computer chip and say, go work as a magnet. These are all efforts to, dismantle on many levels, dismantle Russia's ability to defend itself. All of this will be used against Putin internally by Western propaganda. You create a buffer zone in Donbass. That's what, a lawless buffer zone that Ukrainian terrorists are going to work out of. I mean, guaranteed there'll be rockets and drones flying over every single day, and the West is just not going to see anything. We don't, just like the nuclear commission in Zaporozhye can never tell from where those rounds that are flying, that are coming over their heads and exploding around the facility. And maybe the Russians are over there firing at. They may have gone over there and just fired a few and come back over. We don't know. We can't tell from where it's coming from. So what's your point of even existing as an organization? Well, we know what their point is. They're a spy organization for Western intelligence services. We saw what they did in Iran. And everything else. It just goes down the list of how much sovereignty can we strip, how much we can weaken you. Zaporozhye, Kherson, we'll just freeze that and you give up that portion, which is against the Russian Constitution, which will instantly be used as propaganda to try to oust Putin by more nationalist or more patriotic or patriot-based organizations to try to get some kind of internal conflict going in Russia. So all of this is done for breaking Russia down, weakening it up for the big war while Europe builds up its industry, military industry, try to break BRICS, and try to get rid of the Visegrad group that's now standing firm against, to one degree or another, but standing firm against Brussels. And that may be spreading to other neighboring countries. So this is a multi-pronged attack. It's not just against Russia, but the whole point is Brussels is playing its part. The Green Goblin is playing his part, and it's all to move the same one big plan forward, which is destroy all of our enemies or get them to bicker and destroy themselves, and then we'll just come in and really chop them up and pick up the pieces in a 3 to 5 year time frame when everybody's ready for the big war.
Well, the G8 component, that was a fascinating one. This is the one thing I was thinking unifies everyone. That is, Russia doesn't want to be in the G8, and the rest of the G8 doesn't want Russia there. So it seems like a very strange thing to put into a into a peace agreement. But at least there's something they all seem to agree on. But it does reflect I guess the Washington's underpinning logic, though, that it's necessary to I guess decouple Russia from China. This looks like an anti-BRICS move, but it doesn't. It can't be interpreted in any other way, given that nobody actually wants this. But you bring up a good point, though. With I mean, a lot of your comments kind of reflect the consequences of there not being any trust, and trust is incredibly important if you want to have a peace agreement, because a lot has to be built on trust. Otherwise, everything has to be verified, and there will always have to be some clauses. What happens if it's not actually implemented? And this would be an extremely complicated agreement, and who would ensure that it would be implemented? And so I think over the years there's a reasonable argument to make why Russia should have some be a little bit distrustful. Again, if we the whole source of this thing was, people always go back to pointing out that in the 90s we actually not just had Gorbachev's promise, but we also actually had agreement for having a Europe based on indivisible security. We signed those agreements, but all of this was broken. We have all these arms control deals; they were broken. The NATO Russia Founding Act of 97, many point this out as well. They weren't supposed to put all these troops in new member states. They broke this as well. And the EU actually had a deal with the Russians in 2005 that, again, indivisible security. When we operate in the common neighborhood, we should take each other's security into account. That was broken within the first year. 2014, the Europeans signed under as guarantors for unity government. They walked away from this the day after, pretty much, when the government was toppled. So, and of course, the Minsk agreement is now the massive fear, I think, in Washington. Sorry, in Moscow. That is, yeah, we'll make an agreement, as you say. We even sign a memorandum, and we'll implement it. Then after the ceasefire comes in, and then once the ceasefire is in place, the whole point, which the Americans were quite open about, is we'll change the realities on the ground once the ceasefire is in place. And after a while, they began to speak of the spirit of the Minsk agreement, which was, which can be whatever you want. And then the pressure started mounting on Russia. Well, the situation now is different than it was in 2015. You have to adjust to it. So it is. You can see why there would be little trust, but again, this also can. You can ask to what extent would this be supervised? Because as you mentioned, with the attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, this should have been easy to say, well, this is a step too far. Ukraine shouldn't attack this nuclear power plant. And yet there was this strange play of ambiguity, or who's attacking the nuclear power plant under Russian control. We can't really know, but it's probably Russia. This is, their playbook. After all of this, it is hard to have trust, but that kind of begs the question, with the way you see it in Russia, with the absence of trust in anything that NATO signs. What would an agreement have to look like? Or is it possible to have an agreement when there is no trust?
There was an agreement signed with the Germans in 1945. Capitulation. That's the type of agreement that's going to have to be signed in the end, whether that's from Washington capitulating or NATO, or from Ukraine. We'll live and see. But that's about the extent of any agreement. Look, here's a perfect example. Point 13, as I was saying, Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. Just begin with that. Of course, Russia is integrated with a global economy of 5 billion people. It's just not integrated in the economy, actually about 1.5 billion on the Western side. But the first sub-point is the lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon in stages and on a case-by-case basis. I'm not quite sure how the EU works, because basically it's still an unelected dictatorship in one way or another. But the US, the president can't lift sanctions. In fact, sanctions and tariffs are not even his forte. That's Congress. But Trump, under one pretext or another, emergencies, has decided that, and Congress hasn't really fought back very hard, that he can level tariffs. But sanctions can only be level or removed by Congress. So the way the U.S. normally functions on all of this is trust us. The president will sign this agreement, and you sign this agreement. You go ahead and start implementing. We'll catch up. We just got to push it through Congress. Except it never goes through Congress, or Congress eventually will mull it over for 5-10 years and just say no. While you're implementing the agreement inside, they just goes, we wanted to. We really, really wanted to. But, there's little bastards in Congress. They just wouldn't sign off to it. Sorry. Oh, did we take advantage of you? It happens. And that's constant. There's nobody in Washington, with very few exceptions, one of whom is quitting. They may be running for president, maybe running for governor of Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Except for a few people like that, 99% of the American government are sophont. They are thieves. They are murderers. They are psychotic people, like Lindsey Graham, for example, is a prime example. He's just louder than the vast majority of them. This little man gets off on talking about how he gets people killed. I mean, you understand that beyond all his other mental issues, there's serious issues. The guy is a sociopath, and there's a whole chunk of the American electorate that loves that. They're the bombs away, rockets away. Let's go kill a Team America, hoorah! Who are we bombing today? Because a great nation has to kill somebody constantly. That's how we show we're a great nation. We bomb somebody's cities, we murder somebody's children. Hooray, we're a great nation. That it's a very perverted, insane mentality. But the U.S. is sick with it, and the people are sick with it too. The U.S. I mean, there's a Russian saying, "Народ получает государство, которое заслужило." The people get the government that they deserve. So when your government is full of psychopaths, it's because your society has gone that way, and your society supports that. In the end, it all ends very, very badly for that society. Very badly for that society. Either that society gets destroyed in war and mass suffering and mass die-off, or the people that you've put in power will eventually start destroying themselves to keep the power no matter what. Either way, nothing good ever comes out of that society. They'll go through a very long dark period. They may come out of them, they may not come out of them. But they've put these people in power, and the government is sick, very sick, perverted, twisted people in power, with very few exceptions. And those exceptions either get bought up or they get crushed and pushed out. Marjorie Taylor Greene's a prime example of that. I wish her luck. She's an honest broker. She's an honest person, and she's a rarity. And if the majority of people were like that in the U.S. government, you could deal with the U.S. government. You could deal with the European governments uh, if they actually represented the needs or wants of your country. Nationalists, I'm talking ultra nationalists, nationalists, or more popular these days, patriots, whichever way you want to call them. They're not dangerous because they're predictable. They're standing up for their country's interests. And if you understand what the country's interest is, you can negotiate something. Yeah, maybe you give something away, they give something away, but you come up with something. Ideologues are very difficult to deal with because they have shutters on, and they're going for their goal no matter how many people they have to sacrifice and what they have to destroy. And corrupt individuals are even worse because you think they've agreed to something, they're just waiting to be bought by someone else, whether it's the Israelis, it's the Americans, or whomever else. The Saudis, whoever can drop enough money or golden golf clubs into their pocket, they'll swing that way because they're for sale. They're political prostitutes. So that makes it a very difficult issue to deal with people. And then you get the absolutely insane megalomaniacs and narcissists. Trump fits into that pretty well too. That you have to kind of cuddle, but you don't know what he's going to do tomorrow. So you can't trust anything. You can cuddle him and tell him what he wants to hear, and walk away from a deal this morning thinking, okay, finally we got a deal. We kissed his arson off. We gave him golden golf clubs. We gave him a new airplane. We've got a deal. And by evening time, God only knows what the hell the man's thought about or who's whispered in his ear. We're in a very dangerous time because there's no predictability. And when there's no predictability, you have to accept worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is if the enemy has a capability to try to do a first strike, they will do a first strike. So your logic, by that logic of escalation, is to do a first strike before the enemy can do a first strike. And we're going down that route very, very quickly. And first strike for Russia may be nuclear-tipped hypersonic missiles. It may be Oreshnik missiles. It may be something else. But the threat and the pressure on Russia is there. Russia can deliver a first strike. There'll be of course there'll be a U.S. second strike. How much it can defend against that, it's questionable. But Russian Zircon hypersonic missiles can be nuclear tipped with a tactical nuclear warhead. But a Russian tactical nuclear warhead is a 75 kiloton nuclear warhead. It's twice the size of Hiroshima. Something like that landing in the center of Washington. Goodbye, Washington. Goodbye, the whole government. Instantaneously, you'd have from a submarine launching that from 300 kilometers out to a strike, you'd have about 3 minutes. If the strike is even if the launch is even detected early enough. So nobody's going to escape in 3 minutes. But you're looking at that, but that's the logic that we're going to. That's in the inescapable logic that we're moving to constantly. And the West is doing everything to propagate that logic. When you're dealing with nuclear powers that are questionable whether or not somebody's going to do a first strike on me. And in the U.S., I'm sure somewhere, at least somebody in the U.S. understands this and maybe thinking, well, maybe we should do a first strike. And you start going up that chain that only ends in one way. The only question is how many missiles can either side launch, or how many missiles can be stopped by air-to-air missiles from fighters, by ground-based anti-aircraft missiles, and so on, or intercepting enemy subs. But that's a very theoretical question. It only gets answered when things go flying, and then it's too late to back out of that theory, whether you're right or wrong. So unfortunately, but as long as the West is playing insane, they're going to get insane prizes back at them. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. But that seems to be the marker in the West. And yeah, there's nobody. Who do you trust? Who can you physically, sanely trust in the West? You can trust Orban because Orban represents his interests. He's not pro-Russian. He's pro-Hungarian. You trust Fisco, but neither one of those have any real influence in the West. They have influence inside their countries. They have influence in that they can block certain amendments, and eventually they do get negotiate what they want, and they sign off on every sanction package. Let's not forget that too. But in the overall big scheme of things, they don't decide anything. Brussels decides to some degree. Washington decides to the majority, and look who you're dealing with.
I feel we're the frogs in the pot, which is gradually heating up because, look how far we've gone. Remember the Obama days when he said, even javelins, this would be too dangerous escalation, and the Russians would have escalation dominance in their region. This was common sense. Of course, then Trump's first administration comes along and pushes this. We had the F-16s, starting World War III, we can't send F-16s. And we take that to the present era where we very comfortably participate in sneak attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent. I mean, this is kind of insane. You have German generals cheering on when this watch on TV German tanks invading Kursk. I mean, this is where we're at. So it is dangerous. And as you said, this is complemented with the rhetoric. Your reference, of course, is to Senator Lindsey Graham and, making this very weird speech that everything is going well because we're killing all the right people. I'm not sure, they're killing a lot of people these days across the Middle East, Iran, Russian. So it's hard to, yeah, probably he referred to all of them, which they're killing. I mean, but this kind of language, this posturing, it is just so crazy. But we've gotten so used to it. This gradual incrementalism in escalation of both actions and words. But just on you mentioned before the reasons why they can't trust anything. That you said the Americans will just say, you implement your part, will come later. There's a brilliant quote by Bill Clinton when he was president at the time of the signing of the NATO Russia Founding Act, because this was seen as something to calm the Russians down. We'll expand NATO, but we'll make this deal for you, which you'll know that will never actually put infrastructure further towards your border. And the quote by Bill Clinton is, it actually says, oh, so let me get this straight. We can sign this deal, but if we wake up tomorrow, decide we don't want to follow it anymore, then we can just throw it out. Oh, yeah, wonderful. Okay, let's sign it. I mean, this is an actual, well, I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember word by word, but this is kind of the mentality, though. But how do you explain, though, because this is one thing that continuously perplexes me, the reluctance to take into consideration the Russian security concerns. I mean, this shouldn't be controversial. In any deal, you have to consider all parties. But indeed, over the past 30 years, we built a whole European security architecture based on the principle that Russia shouldn't have a seat at the table, and we don't actually discuss the Russian security concerns either. I mean, for 30 years, this is largely what brought to the collapse of the security architecture in Europe and the present war. But even now, when we read the European proposal for peace, it's, well, all we need is for Ukraine to feel safe and for NATO to restore its dominant position. So Ukraine has to join NATO. They need powerful security guarantees, European troops in Ukraine, and no territorial concessions. And while we're at it, the Russians should pay full reparation. So we're going to keep all their money. I mean, this is, even when Russia has won the war, and it has won the war, this is there is no room, not one line in there was about what the Russians need to feel secure. it is. I mean, if you go through the military and political leaders of Europe throughout the history, we never had any of this before. This is just a different world. How do you make sense of this? So I know you're not
Well,
a psychologist, but how, you know, you have to. This is a. I don't know. I find it very, very. You know, you don't agree with every different side. You know, the Americans, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, but nonetheless, it should make sense. That's what I'm thinking.
you know, um, a good saying, war is the health of the state. And when you cut past the myths and read real history, I got more books than that behind me. I got a couple other bookshelves. When you go read actual American history, not the fairy tales that are taught in American schools, but that are taught in American universities. I've had friends who were history majors, and I've taken more than a few history classes along the way in universities, and it's crap. It's all just advanced versions of myths. When you start digging in and reading actual history, you find out very quickly there's two things going on here. Uh, there's the only two things that are really uniting the United States is the dollar, this shared possible prosperity, and common enemies. You constantly have to have an enemy because without that enemy, the United States falls apart. It would have fallen apart early on because there were absolutely different colonies of different people with different traditions forming different towns and cities that had really nothing in common except maybe this some kind of quasi dream about making it big, i.e., the dollar, and the fear of some enemy, whether it's Indians, whether it's the British, whether it's the Mexicans, and so on and so on. So the U.S. constantly has to have an enemy to dominate anything around it. Now, if we're talking about, we shouldn't be talking about 30 years. Let's go back to when all of this really started. 1948, the formation of NATO. NATO was formed before the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was an answer to NATO. The interesting thing is, when the US started forming NATO, they got their first request from the East to join NATO. That is Stalin. Stalin said, hey, so there won't be a third world war. Let's form a European architecture for security. Boy, that sounds familiar, doesn't that? 1948, 1947, Stalin, the evil dictator that wants to rule the whole Europe and his tanks are going to just roll over France any day now, is asking, hey, let's join an organization so we don't have any more wars. We don't want wars. We don't want any more world wars. The U.S., of course, said, I'm sorry, did you not figure out who NATO is aimed at? Well, Stalin did pretty damn quickly. So Stalin was told, no, you're not going to join NATO. Warsaw Pact gets formed. We could have avoided an entire Cold War. But if we avoided the entire Cold War, the U.S. wouldn't dominate Europe. The U.S. wouldn't launch Operation Gladio that operated from 1948 to 1992 while it was growing this. And it operated not only in U.S. with the stay behind armies and terrorist organizations that the U.S. Created across all of Europe that was not part of the Warsaw Pact. So neutral countries, they got their share of U.S.-backed terrorists. They were killing left politicians and right politicians because politicians like de Gaulle, when he was planning on getting rid of Algeria, and he did it because, while the French are screaming Algeria is an integral part of France, de Gaulle did the math. They're multiplying a hell of a lot faster than we are. We've depopulated because of two world wars. They're going to flood us, and they're not French. They're Frenchianized, but they're not French. So let's negotiate, release them. There was a group of officers that rebelled, mutinied, took control of Algeria for a short period of time, and they were backed by the CIA stay behind forces, and they tried to assassinate de Gaulle and his whole family. De Gaulle took that very badly. And to call de Gaulle a leftist, you'd have to be insane. There's absolutely no leftist in there. But de Gaulle exterminated all of them and then left NATO. And later on, France obviously came back to NATO after a color revolution was installed to de Gaulle, because he also went back and said very loudly, give me my gold. Here's your green papers, your green candy wrappers, give me my gold. Everybody else went there and said it quietly. De Gaulle just made it loud, so you got a color revolution. But the whole point is the U.S. has been controlling Europe in one way or the other, creating this myth of any day now the Soviets are going to charge across, which the Soviets had no intent of charging across. It's just like the Great Game. The Great Game was played by the British, and the Russian Empire didn't even know there was a Great Game going on. If you look at their archival evidence, there was no intent by Russia to invade or to annex or to colonize Afghanistan or the Indian subcontinent. There was no interest in it ever. Yeah, Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Feared, the fourth, had some idea to send an expeditionary force there. They went a couple hundred kilometers and they turned around and went back. But that was the 1400s, for God's sakes. The 1500s. So there was nothing. There was never really this plan, but it had to be an enemy. And the U.S. Then, while controlling to these savage organizations, created these so fronts that they use now as Western leaders. They grew them up from scratch, effectively. And then they don't need to have the state of Mars because they've got traders in every single European country, just about, they feel themselves more American and know there's an air base waiting for them to land on and money in their accounts in the U.S. if everything goes badly in whatever European country you're in. So jump forward 1992, Yeltsin asked to join NATO. And I did an interview with Colonel Wilkerson, and he was Colin Powell's chief of staff in the military, and when Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, Minister of External Affairs, International Affairs. And he was saying, they took that offer, they took that request very seriously, and they actually were planning on working on that. But Clinton won the elections, and Clinton had some sexual liaisons that he shouldn't have been having, particularly in the Oval Office. And he needed to act tough, so they deep sixed the Russian request, and they started this whole process. And then Putin came in, and Putin asked to join NATO. But of course, at this point, Russia was looking like it's getting back on its feet, and now the U.S. absolutely doesn't want Russia in NATO because it doesn't need a second U.S. in NATO. It needs to dominate NATO. It needs to be NATO with all these little vassal serfs running around doing what they're told. They don't need a competitor in the same organization, and by that point they've also figured out that going over to Islamic terrorism as the big boogeyman didn't work. Because yes, they could blow things up, especially if they're aided by Western intelligence organizations. They could really blow stuff up. But overall, they were never a threat to anyone, even the smallest government in NATO. So making a crusade out of them, a long-term earning prospect. I mean, they earned for 20 years in Afghanistan. Let's not forget that. But as a long, big boogeyman, it didn't work. So let's go back to Russia, and then we added on China to that boogeyman list. I mean, the U.S. The difference here, though, is in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. spent the most conservative figures I've seen is 5 trillion. The more liberal figures is 14 trillion. Most are saying somewhere around $7 and $8 trillion that the U.S. just printed out of thin air. Which caused a huge amount of inflation, of course. And that was just wealth transfers from future generations to the buddies of the politicians and the politicians' own pockets. Problem is the U.S. can't do that with Ukraine. So it has to siphon off the money from somebody else, i.e. the Europeans in this case. You can't do trillions, but it could get trillions from Europe if Europe is fighting a war with Russia, and the U.S. is the neutral, arbitrary, and arms seller. Because, by the way, one of these points is also that the U.S. is going to be the neutral party to settle Russian NATO differences. So NATO's soul, spine, brain, and major organs are going to be the neutral party to settle the disputes between Russia and NATO. So overall, I mean, the U.S. has to have either dollars or enemies, or both, better than ever. Otherwise, the U.S. starts to fall apart. It regionalizes. The people have nothing. I mean, it's a country that doesn't have a single religion, has multiple cultures, a lot of them competing with each other, very different backgrounds of the people that came there, loyalties that are more regional than nationwide, crumbling infrastructure, crumbling economics. What does it have to unify?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, I think this, yeah, the historical context you lay out is quite important because, if you leave out these important things, like you mentioned Gladio, where they leave behind the infrastructure to of the United States within Europe, but also the British operational unthinkable. Though it's worth remembering that World War II in Europe ended in May of 1945, and then in the same month, the British put forward a plan to use what remained of the German army, that is the Nazis, and also team up with the United States to invade the Soviet Union. That is to stab them in the back, you know, days after the victory. That is, this was a plan. And as I said, with NATO being established in 1949, and then with West Germany joining in 1955, you have you have reasonable concern. But when you leave out that part and why there should be concern on the Soviet side, the only history you remain with is, well, why did the Soviets not leave Poland? Why did they try to establish control? I mean, this kind of makes sense. If you see that your allies are planning to stab you in the back and attack you, you would create a buffer zone. And that's not a normative argument whether or not it's good or bad. It's just that's how states act to survive. But when we leave this out, we have this narrative of the Russians always waiting to come for us, and it's never because what we do. So there's no security competition. It's just the good guys holding back the bad guys. So it does make it very difficult to make peace. And just
Good.
yeah, just a last
Just
note.
one
Though.
thing, and
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
there's been some declassified documents from the KGB. There's a lot of very classified documents. I don't know why they remain classified. They've started to classify quite a few documents, and one of the documents that was declassified at the beginning of this year, a series of documents, were reports in 1939 that that the British and the French were planning, along with whatever allies they could muster up, were planning to invade the Soviet Union through Finland and through Iran and Turkey in 1940. Germany, I guess they just left out, and Germany felt offended. Uh, so, but they were cultivating the infrastructure. By the way, when World War II, Barbarossa particularly kicked off. So not World War II itself, but when Barbarossa kicked off, the Soviet Union maintained an entire field army in the Caucasus almost to about 1944. And the reason they did that was Chamberlain was very actively trying to convince Ataturk to invade southern Soviet Union into the Caucasus. And Ataturk was wavering whether or not to. In the end, he declared war on Germany. I think in the last week or so of the conflict to show that yeah we were there too. But the reality was the Turks were piling up on the border with the Soviet Union, and the aims were to invade the Soviet Union through the Caucasus, through Iran, which the British took and used gas weapons to conquer, and through Finland in its own time. So and when you start looking at it, who's the good guys, who are the bad guys again? The same time when Poland refused to allow the Soviet Union to move troops to defend Czechoslovakia, and the Czech prime minister was sitting in a corridor waiting to find out what was going to be left of his country as the British and the French and the Germans were divvying it up between Germany, Poland, Hungary, and an independent vassal Slovakia for the Germans. When you look at this realistically, the aim has always been Drach nach Ost. The only question is who's doing the movement to the east, whether it's the British and the French, or whether it's the Germans, or all three combined, or the Americans in this case too. So, yeah, should the Soviet Union, now Russia, be paranoid? I think a certain amount of paranoia is more than due. Definitely don't trust and definitely verify, because and let's not forget Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, Merkel and Holland, they were running to the press to declare, of their own volition, nobody's holding a gun to their heads, how they fooled the Russians. The aim was always war with Russia, not war with just the eastern rebelling provinces, but war with Russia. We're getting ready to have Ukraine so they could fight a war with Russia. And when all of this started, there's one other point. There were two very large derge. So these are diversionary and reconnaissance groups. Ukrainian, they were inside the Russian territory, on the territory of Russia. I'm not talking the Donbass, I'm not talking Eastern Ukraine, but inside Russia. One was in Rostov Oblast, the other one was in Voronezh Oblast. They were surrounded and exterminated. But they were already inside because the aim of the Ukrainians was to wipe out the eastern provinces the Lugansk and Donetsk, and then keep going into Rostov, into Taganrog, toward Belgorod, well, not Belgorod, toward Voronezh, I'm sorry, with the aim of this would destabilize the Russian government, cause internal disputes, and topple Vladimir Vladimirovich. This Russia preemptively attacked with an army half the size of the Ukrainian force. So this hasn't stopped, and it hasn't stopped yet, and it still won't stop. So not only do they not consider Russia's security, their only concern is how to destroy Russia. And unfortunately, the vast majority of Western politicians still have that mindset. It hasn't stopped. It's continued to progress. And I think only a massive, massive defeat on the battlefield will ever at least even slow this down.
Well, yeah, just last note. I think this is what makes any peace agreement so complicated. I mean, towards the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev made this comment that for the Americans as well as the Soviets, they have to realize if they make peace, what this actually means, because once there's peace, the entire power structure falls apart. That is, especially for a hegemon like the United States, you have to divide the world into adversaries and allies. Those are dependent on you, and those are contained. Once peace breaks out, everything falls apart. That is the mass amount of power Washington and Moscow enjoyed from the Cold War, having two centers of power. A lot of this was dependent on perpetual conflict. So once the conflict ends, the alliance systems begins to break down, unless, of course, as you said, one reinvents your enemies and then keep it going. So no, I don't know. I wish I would have seen more efforts in this peace deal and more discussing the thoughts behind it, because the fact that they still call it a Russian-Ukraine peace deal as opposed to a complete collapse of European security architecture, which was never really there to begin with. You feel you can't really deal with the problem unless you identify it first. Anyways, any final thoughts before we go?
Yeah, Washington is running out of time. This is why the desperation's happening, because the Ukrainian army is finally collapsing. The attrition warfare is getting into the late stage, where the one side collapses and then the big gains begin. Russian troops are already on the edges of Gulai Polya after the eastern border areas, defensive areas collapse. With it closing, Pokrovsk is fully in Russian hands. Mirograd is a cemetery, where what's left of the Ukrainian forces are dying in mass or surrendering. That opens up a 100-kilometer front with frontage with nothing really to stop Russian advances except the Dnieper River, and that's a temporary border. That's not the ocean. That's just a river and a river valley. The Kupiansk direction, Ukrainian forces are collapsing and moving back. So what Washington sees is very, very soon that 18 or so percent of the of Donetsk Oblast that's still under Ukrainian control is evaporating. It may be gone within 2 months. Zaporozhye, the front is collapsing. And there that front's going to move to its natural borders. Way is the Dnieper River, and Russian forces are at least small amounts of Russian forces already in north and south of Kherson across the river. And by the way, Russia controls the Dnieper River. Ukraine has no economic future, because that's like controlling the Mississippi in North America, or the Amazon, for Brazil. Additionally, when you look at it, the rhetoric on Russia's side has not so subtly, I would say, changed toward Kharkov, Sumy, Dnepropetrovsk Oblast. The word now being used is liberation. Villages being liberated. So that sends the clear signal of we're here to stay. We can be here to stay on a large footing or a small footing. All depends when this ends. And that's the mentality. And Washington started to notice that. Obviously, it's hard not to notice. Zelensky, I don't know how much he even understands what's really going on the front. I've read and I've heard from different people that he's kept pretty much in the dark because he couldn't handle it. The cocaine addict really couldn't handle the truth. A lot like Hitler toward the end. But the West, it understands where this is all going. Not at least the West, at least the Americans more or less do. I think most of the Europeans are delusional also. So time's running out.
Yeah, I picked up on the change in rhetoric on the Russian side as well. Instead of taking cities, we hear now liberating in Kharkov, which is a good indication of intent. But well, and
Yep.
now it starts to seem the whole thing starts to seem as things collapse and one still refuse any peaceful path. It's starting to seem cruel to the to the Ukrainians, to be honest. Even the former press secretary of Zelensky, Yulia Mendel, she was making the point as well. She went out tweeting that they should take Trump's 20-point deal because they're losing and there's no way to turn this around. And she even blasted Europeans for trying to keep this war alive because they don't have any strategy, they don't have any money, they don't have any weapons. And they don't even talk to Russia, so they have this. They're completely, as you said, become irrelevant. This is the press secretary of Zelensky. So this whole idea that in the Europe that we're helping Ukrainians by dragging this thing on longer and longer. I mean, in her words, this war will only the deal is which is horrible today for Ukraine. It will only get worse day by day. So why would you compare it to some utopia where which is the EU plan where Russia capitulates and Ukraine gets everything? It's quite mind-boggling. But what's so disturbing to me though is the politicians and the journalists, the sheer moral posturing they have when they reject any peace deal and they make outlandish demands which they know can never be met, which will only result in more devastation. It's a very strange. I like I said before, I feel we need to bring in the psychologists at some point because it doesn't really make sense in any IR theory. But yeah, here we are.
Sure. It's very simple. The moral posturing will continue until the first bombs start falling on their heads. And then the moral posturing is going to disappear very quickly. They have no skin in the game, particularly the journalists. They make their salaries off of this. So the skin in the game they have is their money and their fame by backing a specific side or specific point of view. But until their skins are actually really in the game and they're under threat, if there's a full war and Russian missiles are hitting European cities, then suddenly all of this is going to be quite the opposite. How did we get here? Why are we here? Why are we part of this war? Because now their lives are under threat. But as long as somebody else, particularly some Slavs in the East that aren't really human beings, anyways, they're some kind of white apes that barbarians, they're the jungle, they're not part of the garden, and all that kind of rhetoric. Or, as you've seen from German advisors, like I cannot remember this woman's name. She's the morality advisor for NATO. Well, Russians don't really understand death and life the way we do. And by the way, equally goes toward Poles and toward Ukrainians, everybody else. They're not the same as us. These are the talking points that they're back up on stage. They're okay. So a bunch of these pseudo human beings are killing each other. That's good for us. That's nothing. I get paid for pushing this PR. That's the whole mentality. This is money, and this is racism that never went away. The Russophobia, the racism, and that hasn't gone away for the last 400 years.
I very much
Unfortunately,
agree. If we were fighting with our own soldiers, we would have taken a very different path towards peace. But we're fighting with Ukrainians,
absolutely,
so
absolutely agree.
it's quite the distinction there is. I think it's again. I always make the point that I don't think the NATO that they love the Ukrainians. I think they hate the Russians and the willingness to bleed to fight to the last Ukrainian, as the press secretary of Zelensky suggested. I think that is the main difference between the two. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time